Welcome to Moving Digital Health, a podcast series from MindSea Development. I'm your host, Reuben Hall, CEO of MindSea. Each episode, we sit down with leaders and innovators in healthcare to hear their personal stories and explore how they're moving digital health forward. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Lieberman. He is the Edwin M. Lerner II Professor of Biological Sciences, former chair of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University, and a pioneering researcher in human evolutionary biology. Through his books like The Story of the Human Body and Exercised, he has fundamentally changed how we think about sitting, running, and why we're so naturally inclined to avoid the gym. Dan, welcome to the show.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So much of your work is centered on the idea of evolutionary mismatch, the conflict between our ancient bodies and our modern high-tech environment. Could you briefly define that concept for us and explain why you feel it's the most important lens for understanding human health today?
Gosh, well, I'm not sure it's the most important lens, but it's a very important lens. But a mismatch is just essentially it's how evolution works. A mismatch is when an organism is inadequately or imperfectly adapted to novel environmental conditions, right? And that causes and the result of those mismatches are the result. The, what happens is that you get conditions, often diseases, that become more chronic or more severe. So, a simple example would be that if you took a zebra who's adapted to living in the Serengeti and you moved it to, say, northern Canada, that zebra would be very much mismatched, right? It would not be well adapted to those environmental conditions. And the thing is about humans, so all animals get mismatches drive evolution. But the thing about humans is that because of our culture, because of technology, because of how we change our world around us, we have created an incredible speed and with incredible force all kinds of mismatches that cause us to get sick and die and have other conditions. For everything from myopia, which is now very common around the planet, and cavities and flat feet. None of them kill people, but we also heart disease and diabetes and Alzheimer's and the list goes on. Many cancers. These are all mismatches, and so most of us are likely to die from a mismatch and get sick from a mismatch, and so understanding mismatches requires not just medical science, but also an evolutionary perspective, because an evolutionary perspective explains not just how we get them, but also why we get them. And that's really important if you want to prevent them.
Okay. And so you've also noted that humans are evolutionary hardwired to avoid unnecessary exertion to save calories.
Yeah.
So in a world where, we don't have to chase down game and spend hours of the day gathering food, are we fighting a losing battle against our own biology and instinct to preserve energy?
Well, I mean, it's complicated, but basically, yes. Like all creatures, we evolved in energy limited conditions, right? In the past, there were no supermarkets, there were no, Uber Eats, there was no, just abundant, I can walk into a supermarket that's just a few blocks from my house, and there's something like 40,000 different kinds of food in that supermarket. There's an incredible amount of food, and the abundance is extraordinary, right? And a lot of those foods are designed, engineered, to be hyper appealing and filled with calories and fat and sugar and whatever. And the result is we tend to get sick, right? And but it's also true for physical activity, right? Because when you're energy limited, right, when you're struggling to get enough energy to feed yourself and your family, it's kind of a crazy idea to do what we now call exercise. So, like this morning, for example, I went for a 5-mile run along the river here. Um, so I spent about 500 calories to do that run. It was a gorgeous morning, but I didn't need to do that. It was completely voluntary, unnecessary physical activity, right? And which is what exercise is. Exercise I define as discretionary, voluntary physical activity for the sake of health and fitness. And in the past, when our ancestors were extremely physically active in order to get the food that they needed to have to feed themselves and their family, going for a 5 mile run when they're also struggling to get enough energy would be a completely stupid idea, right? So we've invented this thing called exercise in the modern world, where physical activity has become optional, and where there's a deep and fundamental, but also there's a deep and fundamental instinct to kind of avoid it. And so we have this tension, and the vast majority of us are not doing very well. So only about 50% of Americans actually exercise at all. And only about 20% of Americans get what we think is the recommended minimum amount of exercise that you should get. So clearly our instincts are working against us. I'm going to give you a simple example. Right outside my door here is the elevator for the museum where I'm in. And I can tell you that I can observe it all the time. There's this constant stream of people taking the elevator instead of the stairs. Why? Well, because there were no elevators in the Paleolithic, right? It's not a normal thing to do, but it's a deep and fundamental instinct to say, "Oh, I'm going to press that button so you don't have to climb up the stairs." In fact, they press the button also to go down too, instead of taking the stairs down as well. So and then we shame and blame people for their instincts, and which of course I think is a really bad idea, because they're not being lazy. There's nothing wrong with them. They're just being normal human beings, and we've engineered this environment that allows us now to obey our instincts.
You mentioned before that, human culture is changing so quickly that there's no chance for our biology or evolution to, catch up to this new environment that we've created for ourselves. Um, you know, is there any sort of, biological adaptations that, have been happening? Oh, somewhat slow, but or any logical conclusion that an organism would evolve to in this modern environment?
Well, look, here's how natural selection works. Natural selection works through a combination of variation, and some of that variation has to be heritable, so it has to be a genetic basis for that variation, and it has to result has to have an effect on your reproductive success. And almost all the diseases that we're getting from inactivity and from diet, et cetera, almost all of them don't really, uh, make us sick, not to mention kill us until we're grandparents.
Uh-huh.
So, in effect, they're essentially silent to selection. But even more importantly, so that's one issue. The other issue is that a lot of these, uh, selection only happens. It happens really slowly, right? It only happens. You can't design selection. It happens if there's variation that exists that has strong reproductive effect, and so it's slow. It's incredibly slow. So, you know, the changes that we've observed in our environment, over the last few generations, we just talked about the elevator in my building. When I was a student here, I was an undergraduate here. There was a key you had to have to use that elevator. Now there's a button, right? So only the professors had keys, and but now everybody can take the elevator, right? So we've increased the ability for people to not take the stairs anymore in just a few years. So the shifts that are occurring, the environmental shifts that are occurring are so incredibly rapid, whereas the genetic changes take generations, hundreds of generations to occur. So if you care about yourself or your grandchildren or your great grandchildren or even your great 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 grandchildren, waiting for natural selection to solve the problem, A, it's not going to happen, and B, um, that's not the right solution. So look, we can't change our genes, but what we can do is change our environment. And so I think that's the key. We need to figure out how to change our environments in a way to help us overcome some of the instincts that most of us want to overcome. I mean, I don't know many people who don't want to exercise. Um, most people who don't exercise would like to be more physically active. It's just they struggle to do it in an environment and in a world where it's completely unnecessary and often difficult. I mean, in some places it's hard to find the stairs in a building, right? The elevators right in front and center, and you have to go hunt around and find the stairs. In fact, the
Yeah,
hospital.
it's behind a door that's like a fire door to prevent,
Yeah,
so it's hard to find it, and it's hard
yeah,
to push open, and then every floor you gotta go through another door. They do make it very inconvenient.
yeah, exactly. And a lot of some people living in places where there are no sidewalks, where there's, where there aren't playgrounds and the kinds of facilities that you need being physically active. And the list goes on, right? Where people have 2 jobs, 3 jobs, they're commuting long distances in their cars, they're exhausted when they get home. I mean, they would like to exercise, but they've got kids, and we all know how it works, right? It's not that they want to be couch potatoes, but the life forces us to become couch potatoes, and so we need to find ways to help each other without being judgmental.
Yeah, and you've argued that, nearly all successful exercise interventions, share the quality of social commitment. So why is that so much more powerful than, just trying to, follow a coaching plan or, following a streak on your own?
Well, I mean, because let's go back to that initial issue we talked about, which is why people are physically active. And I would argue, and though my book Exercised, I make the case that we evolved to be physically active for 2 reasons and 2 reasons only. One, when it was necessary, or second, when it was rewarding in some way, right? And sometimes it's necessary and rewarding, right? Like to get food, it's necessary to get food, and it's also rewarding to get food. And we've now live in a world where physical activity is no longer really necessary. I mean, you can live your whole day without ever moving, and a lot of exercise is really unrewarding, right? I mean, I put people on treadmills for a living, but I tell you, I hate running on a treadmill. I mean, it's a nasty, horrible machine that makes you work really hard. It gets you nowhere. It's noisy. You can fall off it, etc. I mean, who likes a treadmill? You can try to make it more enjoyable by listening to a podcast or watching something while on the
Right.
treadmill, but that kind of makes it more tolerable. But it's way less enjoyable than going for a run outside. And guess what's even more fun is going for a run outside with friends, right? So the and of course, because we're social creatures, and so the for a lot of people, the best way to make physical activity rewarding is to make it social, and that could be many ways, like going for a walk with a friend. I mean, who considers that exercise? Or going dancing, right? Dancing is intrinsically social. Every culture has dancing. We don't do it enough, but that's obviously social. Who thinks about, you know, exercises, dancing as a form of exercise? Yesterday, Sunday, I went for a run with a whole bunch of friends, right? And it was great. We chatted, we gossiped, we talked, as the miles slipped by. I certainly ran farther than I would otherwise. And it was great. I had a good time, right? But what was fun wasn't so much the running. It was the fact that I was having a great time talking and with my friends. So the study after study shows that that when people make exercise social, they're more likely to do it. They're more likely to do it again, and they're more likely to enjoy it. It's not always the case, but it's often the case.
I definitely see your point there, and see those patterns in my own life as well. Struggling to find the time to get the fitness in. But agree when you're doing with a friend or a team, that social aspect really keeps you moving. And also, I see it with my children as well.
Sure. I mean,
Um,
we love to play. I mean, sports is basically a kind of organized play, and we're one of the few species that plays as adults, and play is intrinsically social, right? So, um, you know, like playing a soccer match or whatever. I mean, there's so many ways to make physical activity social, and and if we could do a better job of helping people do that, I think we would see physical activity rates rise substantially.
so we've seen the rise in digital fitness communities like Strava, for example. How do those digital connections, satisfy our evolutionary need for movement? Can that be helpful as well as in-person social connection?
I mean, it works for some people, right? I'm not on Strava, partly because I don't know. I don't want everybody on the planet knowing, how much I ran last week. I mean, it's just not my thing. But some people love it, right? And I find it really motivating. Partly, I mean, I have a good friend I run with once a week, and she is serious Strava type, and she will sometimes do extra running because it'll look good on her Strava. you know, and if that motivates you, that's great. So for some people, it's really terrific. I think for some people, it's off-putting as well. So Strava works for some people and not for everybody, right? I think if you're struggling, it might not be the best platform, but let 1,000 different kinds of ways to help people bloom. And if for those who like that sort of thing, that's great. But there are other, as fitness apps like my wife has a Apple Watch, and she loves to close her rings.
Mhm.
She's pretty physically active, but I mean, sometimes sometimes she'll like exercise without her watch, and then she'll realize that she didn't get any credit for it, and she'll
I
do
know, it's so
and she'll
disappointing. It's
and
so
she'll do
disappointing.
extra, right? Just to make sure that her watch knows that she did it right. So, and that's great. It works for her. So whatever works is good as long as you find something that that enhances your experience and makes you more motivated. Uh, there's not going to be one size fits all solution to the digital fitness world.
Yeah, and I've definitely tried Strava myself, and I find I'm selective about what I put on there. So if I felt it was a good workout, or if it was long enough or intense enough to put on Strava, then I'll share that and be like, okay, that's people will appreciate that. But like I would say, if I was, inactive for a couple months, I'm just trying to get back into it. I'm going really slow. I'm like, I'm not posting that.
Exactly.
That's
Well,
just
yeah.
terrible.
Well, I broke my toe this winter. I dropped my laptop perpendicularly on my toe, and I had to stop running for like 5, 6 weeks. And if I had been on Strava, that would have been a disaster, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I would just go dark and then try and get back into shape and then just start posting once I'm in shape again. But there is on the other side, there's a concern that, some people just, take it overboard and are constantly, monitoring their health data and developing anxiety around like obsession about, fitness and, ever trying to push the limits of, how many kilometers they can get in a week or, how many calories they're burning. Is that hyper awareness of activity metrics, can that be, a mismatch as well?
Oh, I'm sure it can. I mean, I'm not an expert on this topic, but I have friends who are like this, and people who are obsessing about all the metrics they're getting from their pulse and their you know their all these data that these wearables can now provide. Sometimes it's unclear what to do with some of this information. And I mean, another example would be sleep, right? Um, I mean, most of us know when we've had a good night's sleep. You wake up feeling rested, right? Or you know that you didn't get enough sleep last night. Um, but there are people, and I won't name names, who they wake up in the morning and they check their wearable, and then they for some reason they decide they didn't get really good sleep last night. And these wearables aren't perfect, and I think it just makes them stressed. And of course, stress elevates the cortisol levels. Cortisol is an
Mhm.
arousal hormone, and if your cortisol levels go up, guess what? You're not going to sleep as well. So it can instigate a vicious circle. And so um, I think I've seen this with people who try continuous glucose monitors. I mean, guess yeah, if you wear one of these things, you'll see your blood sugar levels go up after you eat a
Mm.
meal. But what are you going to do with that information? Well, of course, your blood sugar levels go up after a meal, and everybody has different responses. So how do you evaluate what to do with that information? Is complicated, and I think most of us have no idea how to do that. And so I think it can backfire with some individuals. I mean, sure, there's useful information, but I think we need to figure out how to help people find the right information for them, given their particular circumstances and their needs, but without without causing harm. And I don't know the answer to that question, though.
Hmm. I have to say, one of the most stressful experiences of my life was when my daughter was a baby, and I think it was a gift. It was like an infant heart rate monitor for the crib. So there's a little pad underneath, goes underneath the mattress to when they're sleeping. It checks on the heartbeat, and then if it doesn't detect a heartbeat, then the alarm goes off in the parent's bedroom. Well, you can guess what happens, like, she rolls off the mat onto the edge of the crib. "Oh, no, the no heartbeat detected." Alarm goes off in the parents' bedrooms. Parents shoot out of bed, freaking out, like, "Oh my goodness." Of course, first-time parent, everything's an emergency. You rush over there to see, what's going on, and oh, man, it was months until we realized that this was just completely useless and having a negative impact on our life.
Right. Yeah, but of
And
course, yeah,
yeah,
it's there's no one size fits all, but I can imagine in some cases that could be really useful. So it depends on the circumstances.
yes, definitely a system that had less false positives would have been more useful for sure. Um, another thing you talk about in some of your books is the active grandparent hypothesis.
Hmm.
Suggesting that exercise actually turns on repair mechanisms that counteract aging. Um, how could digital health tools be better designed, for that demographic, the 60 plus, grandparent, to really think about repair more than just activity and intensity?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So let me just back backtrack a little bit and talk about the active grandparent hypothesis. So we're an unusual species in that we evolved to live long after we stop reproducing, right? And hunter gatherers evolved uh, to be, grandparents, and but hunter grandparents um, our hunter gatherer grandparents are really active. They spend a lot of time, digging for tubers or hunting and taking care of children, etc. And that physical activity, in turn, helps them stay healthy as they age. I mean, we know that, right? Exercise slows the rate of aging and increases your health span. Health span is the number of years you live without sort of disease, and hence increases your lifespan. Because before modern medicine, your health span was your lifespan. And it turns out that the reason exercise is so healthy, physical activity is so healthy, is that it's stressful. When you're physically active, you not only using energy, but you're also causing some stress throughout your body. Your mitochondria are producing these little reactive oxygen species, and that can cause damage everywhere and mutate DNA, and they cause havoc everywhere. Right? You're stressing the walls of your arteries every time you push blood through them at high rates and pressures. You're causing little tears in your muscles and little cracks in your bones. Every system of your body is stressed, but because we evolved to be physically active, we evolved all kinds of repair and maintenance mechanisms, which we turn on in response to physical activity. So, for example, in the case of those reactive oxygen species, our muscles produce vast quantities of antioxidants, natural antioxidants that wipe up all that damage and more. So you end up you kind of overshoot the damage, and so you end up better off than you were before.
Mhm.
And so that's why physical activity helps people live longer and stay healthy, basically. And um, and the thing is that as we age, physical activity is not less important. Actually, it becomes more important because of course that's when the biological processes of aging have the most effect. And so, as we design and think about ways to help people who are elderly to be physically active, one of the keys is to help them, um, stay active as they age. And one of the things that one of the two major sort of categories of exercise. So one, of course, is aerobic exercise, and that's what most monitors do, right? If you have a heart rate monitor or something, it's measuring your your heart rate, which is telling you basically whether you're doing moderate, vigorous, or light physical activity. But that's generally aerobic physical activity. But as we age, one of the most important kinds of exercise is to do strength training. Strength training helps maintain your muscle mass so you don't become yet frailty. What the technical term is sarcopenia, which is sarco means flesh and penia means loss. So flesh loss is the medical term. But basically, you're losing muscle mass as you age.
Mhm.
And it's really critical that elderly individuals do strength training, at least 2 times a week in order to counter that muscle mass loss so they don't become really frail. Because if they don't, what happens is that, when you're frail, then it gets harder to get out of your chair. It gets harder to do stuff. It gets harder to carry things. You become less active and you kind of drive the cycle forward. So, and the problem is that most of the wearables that we have, pretty much all the wearables we have, measure only aerobic, cardio physical activity, and none of them really do strength. And so we need other kinds of wearables that at the moment don't exist to help people do that. And so, and maybe recognize, when they're not getting enough strength training, so that they can do more.
100%. And you've noted as well that at your workplace, Harvard's, the vast majority of the students aren't very physically active. And you've been critical of universities for, dropping some of those requirements. I know we've, worked together on the Crimson Zip mobile app as an intervention to, get people more physically active, but also layer in that social accountability aspect as well. What have you learned from that exercise of developing the app and seeing how people use it on campus and some of the data you've collected?
Well, um, it's hard. It's really hard. So American college students and Harvard college students are no exception. Are they're more active than some other aspects of the population, but they're no different from the rest of the world, and many of them are not getting as much physical activity as you expect them to, or they should get. And it used to be that every university in the country, and I'm sure it's true of Canada as well, used to require some kind of physical activity. They used to have sort of physical education requirements. And in our case, for example, Harvard dropped them in 1970 during the Vietnam War, and since then there's been fewer students are engaging in exercise. So there a fair number of athletes on campus, and they're doing just fine. But the non-athletes are, well, they run the gamut, from some who train for marathons and some who barely do anything, right? And it has huge effects, right? Because exercise not only has long-term health effects, but exercise has important short-term effects on depression and anxiety and mood, and also affects sleep and all these aspects of health that are critically and important for college students. And so we've been trying to figure out ways to get them more active. And personally, I would like to see the university restore a physical education requirement, because I think there's this idea that the mind and the body are somehow um, separate, and our job is to deal with minds and not bodies. And I completely reject that philosophy. But I'm afraid that I'm not going to win the day and get my colleagues to agree that we should restore a physical activity requirement. That would be considered some kind of unacceptable coercion. So, although we coerce our students to do all kinds of other things, but that's another story. But so we've been trying other methods, and so we tried working on this app, this Crimson Zip app, and the idea again is to make it very social. And to be honest, the problem with the app is that, as you might expect, the students who are really active are the ones who are using it, and the ones who are less active are the ones who are less likely to use it. So we
Right.
still haven't managed to crack that nut yet. But our hope is that as the app people get more used to it and we make it more social, that maybe more and more folks will adopt it, and it'll begin to sort of take off in the way that some other sort of social apps have done so. But it's a work in progress. We always knew this would be a marathon, not a sprint, and so we're still in the stages of developing it.
I see. So it's been a useful tool for those students who are already, active and engaging in those activities, and helps them, meet up and organize social sports events, but not exactly, getting people out of the chair who weren't going to do that in the first place.
Yeah. So we haven't got to the stage where we've been able to do the kind of, like to use the app to do some experiments, really, to collect data. We haven't yet got to that stage yet, but we hope to do that soon and randomize students and sort of test some hypotheses, but we're not there yet.
For sure, and I recognize that it is a long-term endeavor, and the longer you're collecting that data for over time, that hopefully it becomes more valuable as you see different cohorts come through the system. And I know that the team at MindSea really enjoyed the collaboration and with the researchers and working on the app to promote the social exercise and accountability.
Yeah. And I've been actually involved a little bit with the English government, which was is thinking about trying to do something like this as well. So who knows? Maybe it'll get larger.
So going back to our hunter-gatherer roots, if a Hadza hunter-gatherer was wearing an Apple Watch or some other fitness tracker for a week, what would we be surprised at when looking at their data? Uh,
I think a lot of people have this idea that our ancestors and hunter gatherers are these sort of crazy active people who are doing like marathon sort of like physical activity levels, or swimming the English Channel or climbing Mount Everest or whatever. And what you'd find is that they're very physically active compared to your average person, but they're not crazy physically active. They're just kind of normally physically active. So they engage based on data, for example, from heart rate monitors and accelerometers. They do about 2.25 hours a day of sort of moderate to vigorous physical activity, maybe about 20 minutes a day of vigorous. The rest is moderate, and the rest of the day they're doing kind of light activities. So although they spent about 10 times more energy being physically active than say your average, well, maybe 10 times more steps or something, but
mhm.
it depends on how you want to count it. There's different ways of counting physical activity. They're much more active than your average American. I think many people would be surprised to see that they're quite active, and they're very healthy levels of activity, but they're not crazy active. Um, and I think that's useful information, because I think there are all kinds of myths out there about what we evolved to be. And these paleo fitness people who you know walk around carrying giant rocks and running barefoot, and whatever they're
Yeah, this
doing.
romanticized view
Yeah,
of
it's
our,
kind of a cartoon characterization of what life was like in the Stone Age, and it wasn't like that at all. At least based on our data from contemporary hunter gatherers. But they are very active. The other thing is that you know as they get older, they do get less active, as far as we can tell from the very few studies. But even still, the most active, like among the Hadza, like a 70-year-old Hadza is doing about 150 minutes of moderate physical activity a day.
mhm,
That's in one day. They're doing what the US government and the World Health Organization are begging Americans to do in a week, right?
yeah.
So that's in one day. That's like 70, 80-year-old Hadza. So, so they're, you know, I think we have a lot to learn from them.
So this might be tough to have an exact answer for, but what modern profession or job would be most equivalent to the amount of activity they're getting in a day?
I
Um,
don't know the answer. I wonder about maybe somebody who like delivers mail in a city, like here in Cambridge, our mail person walks from house to house instead of driving. So something like that. But look, the other thing we should think about this is an important point, which is that just because our ancestors did or didn't do something doesn't mean it is or isn't what we should be doing, right?
mhm.
Um, um, it's not like I mean, clearly it's important that we be physically active, but it's not like there's a simple dose that you can get from the Paleolithic that we should replicate. Um, the evidence uh, inevitably points to the following sort of conclusion, which is that some activity is always better than none, and there's a kind of an increased benefit from more. And of course, it's complicated in terms of dose, in terms of intensity and frequency and duration, etc. And then eventually the benefits sort of tail off. So there is no one. It's not like you can't give out like a medical dose, like for a pill. This is
Mhm.
what you should be doing. It doesn't work that way, and I think that so the key is really to think about, if you're struggling to be more physically active, try to figure out some way to be slightly more physically active. Take the stairs or more often than the elevator, or park your car farther away from, slowly build up that physical, because anything is better than nothing. And as you do it, you'll get better and better and get fitter and fitter, and you can kind of build on those shifts.
Mhm. So even though, as if you've mentioned, exercise is kind of a modern medicalized invention, it's still a good thing because it's enabling a lot of people to be more healthy than they would without it. And at the end of the day, we shouldn't try and be a hunter gatherer because that's what our ancestors were, but that's not the environment we live in. It's whatever level of activity is allows us to lead a healthier life is good at the end of the day.
Amen. I completely agree.
And whatever tools help us get there, whether it's closing our rings or seeing ourselves on the leaderboard of Strava. It's basically whatever step in the right direction, whether it's digital or social accountability, it's a good thing at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And another example of a social example is Peloton. Um, I, Peloton, when you do like a Peloton workout, even though you might be, you know, looking at a TV screen, there's somebody exercising along with you, cycling or running or rowing or whatever the Peloton thing you like. And even though it's, somebody's in a studio in New York or London, and you're in your basement in Boston, it's weirdly social, right? And it works. So there are all kinds of solutions to this need, and there's never going to be a one size fits all. And I think that as we explore and develop more technologies, I'm hoping that we can help more people be physically active, because as you say, there's very few things you can do that will have more effect on your health, both mental and physical, than staying physically active.
I found the virtual cycling really engaging as well. So that's why
Yeah. Yeah,
you're
you're
on
doing
your
the Tour de France,
stationary bike and you're, have a nice big TV in front of you and you're cycling through the side streets of an old town in France. And then this other virtual cyclist comes up beside you and starts going a little bit faster than you are. And you're like, oh, I got to keep up with them. And it's all imaginary,
if,
but
if it works, it's great.
it gets me pedaling faster, and it's like whatever tricks you have to play to get that pedal to move
It works.
faster, it works.
Absolutely. But I often wonder, like, what would my grandfather have thought of that? Like, I mean, I'm sure he wouldn't have been opposed to it, but he would be like, "You're doing what? I mean, why not just go out and bicycle or something?" But I mean, it is a very strange modern technology. But if it works, and if it works for you, fine. But I mean, one of the jokes I love to make is that I've got in my basement. I bought all these weights. I bought these heavy metal things whose sole purpose is to be lifted. I mean, imagine explaining that to our great 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 grandparents. Like you did what? You spent your money on some heavy thing to lift just for no purpose other than to lift it. They think we're nuts. But again, if they lived in our world, they would realize that maybe it's a good thing.
True enough. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, Dan. Really appreciate it, and thanks to everyone for listening to the Moving Digital Health podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please go to movingdigitalhealth.com to subscribe to the MindSea newsletter and be notified about future episodes. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.